this session on building resilience. I'm Melanie Pearl, for those of you who don't know me. I'm one of the employment advisors at Work Avenue. Good to see some of my clients here, and also former clients who now have jobs, as well as new people as well, which is what, of course, we always aim for. I also run an HR consultancy, and that's where I met, well, through the working in HR is how I met Jane Hirst a number of years ago in that capacity. Jane runs a training and development business called The People Specialist, and she is an expert at helping people to achieve their full potential. She's full of energy, full of enthusiasm, and that energy is infectious, as I'm sure you will see. And at a time like this, I really can't think of a better person to help us to build the resilience we need. So I'm just going to hand over to Jane. Thank you very much.
Oh, Melanie, that was lovely. Thank you so much for such a warm introduction. And hi, everybody. Thank you for choosing this session today. I'm going to actually be talking about developing your personal resilience, because I think, as Mel said, this year's been quite an interesting year for us all, hasn't it? And starting our own businesses or wherever we are in the work cycle, well, then we need to actually find the coping mechanisms to actually take that forward. And so I'm actually going to show you some of my go-to tools. I've put a presentation together, which I'm going to share the screen in a moment. But I'm going to ask Mel if she's going to help me out and look into the chat, because I know that I'm quite nosy, and when I go to the chat and look at that, well, then I lose my kind of thought process. So I want to keep on track with that. I'll go to Mel every so often to check out what's in there and take your questions, either through the session or as we actually get towards the end. I hope that I've left enough time to actually talk about it. But as I say, I'm going to actually give you 6 tools today. So there's quite a lot in a short period of time, but I hope you think that there'll be ones that are pragmatic ones that you can use straight away, both in your work life and in your home life, because I think it's essential that we actually look at both of those sides. So let me just share my screen with you. So this is the one that I actually want to actually look at. And what you'll see on here is that I've chosen a little quote that I've got 99 problems and 86 of them are completely made up scenarios in my head that I'm stressing about for absolutely no logical reason. And I think the reason that I wanted to show this is that, you know, when we actually think about things, our mind is absolutely a helpful part or a hindering part to us. And we need to be actually looking at those voices. I know that Barbie said earlier that, you know, we've all got voices in our heads. And usually I've got Tigger and Eeyore that are sitting near me because I've either got Tigger sitting on my shoulder or Eeyore that either helps me and thinks, yes, we can do it and we can be bouncy about it. Or we've got Eeyore that's maybe the voice in our head that's not so good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at 3 key things today, describe what resilience means, why it's important right now, and then some practical skills to help us bounce back and thrive rather than just thinking how we're going to get through. I want us to be able to thrive and deal with this as we go on. So let's look at the first one about what is resilience. And when I see resilience, well, then resilience is about the ability to bounce back fast from setbacks. Looking at our coping mechanisms and being able to dig deep into our resources and be able to use all of them to be able to get what we actually want. So if we think about resilient people, they have the ability to sustain their energy level under pressure, to cope with disruptive changes and adapt. They bounce back from setbacks. They're also able to overcome major difficulties without engaging in dysfunctional behaviour or harming others. And this is really key because we need to be actually looking at how we respond to situations rather than react. And one of the things that Barbie was talking about earlier was breathing, and we're going to actually look at that because it's so crucial that we remember to breathe in everything that we're actually doing, and it helps us be able to actually manage some of those situations. So why is it important? If we think about the world that we've actually lived in the last 10 months, well, then everything's been a bit topsy-turvy. But I was actually introduced to this acronym in about 2005, and I don't know whether you've heard about the VUCA world that we're living in at the moment. And that VUCA stands for, it's a volatile world, it's uncertain, it's complex, and it's ambiguous. Now, this was introduced to me as a director when we were sitting on a board, a local board actually, in North Finchley. And it was 2005. And he said, you know, this is how the world is. And when I look at it now, it's even more so. And, you know, we need to be realising that actually the world that we live in, it might not be always about COVID, but there's always going to be uncertainty. There's always going to be risks. And it's how we actually turn that on its head and look at that being more of, you know, how we can create some vision and some understanding so that, you know, we actually see where we can be going and how we actually want to be dealing with things. Have some clarity around it. And so that, you know, we can break it down into little parts. And have the agility to be able to move and flex. I think a lot of people are talking about pivoting at the moment, but agile is about being able to flex and see what we can do differently. So let's just have a little look at, you know, some of the key characteristics that we have as resilient people. And this again kind of links into our mindset that we need to be thinking about ourselves in a positive way. So when we've got a positive self-perception, we're looking at our efficacy of what we can do rather than what we can't do. We tap into our emotional intelligence. And so we recognise, you know, when things are happening for us and, you know, when it's happening for other people too. And that might mean that we're aware of our reactions. And so what kind of triggers we have? I don't know about you, but one of my triggers is not listening to the news on a night time because, you know, if I listen to the news late at night, well, then, you know, it can make me feel quite anxious. So cutting that out altogether. There's also the understanding and accept that life is full of challenges. You know, sometimes it does happen, you know, and things do go wrong, but it's actually how we think about it rather than this is a way of life and that being. And if we can think about how we can become problem solvers and rather than thinking about, you know, where things are and just dwelling on that, that helps us move forward. Survivors rather than victims. So, you know, when we look at resilient people, well, then they're not, oh, it's me, it's happened, it always happens to me. You know, this isn't something that we actually think about. It's about thinking about how we can actually survive this, look at what we've learned from it. And one of the biggest things that I've found during this period is that when we compare ourselves to others, well, then that can actually be really bad news for us because when we look at what's happening, especially in social media, how many of you have actually looked on social media during the last 9 or 10 months and seen people posting about, you know, how brilliant things are and how busy they are and how successful. And this, when we actually take that on board, well, then it can actually make us feel much less positive and probably inferior. So stop comparing. And believing that you have control of the outcomes. When you actually look at that, well, then we can see that. One of the biggest things I think as well for me is about having the ability to ask for help. And this is actually a real strength for me because when I started out in business many years ago, well, then it was thinking about, oh, do I want to ask for help? Is it seen as being vulnerable? Is it seen as being weak? Well, actually, there's so many people out there that may be going through some of the same things. It's actually asking for that help and being able to deal with it. So if this is some of the key characteristics for resilient people, I just wanted to actually highlight, before I go any further, this guy, James Clear. Because if you haven't come across James Clear, well, then really make a note of his name now. Because he wrote a book called Atomic Habits. And I find that he pops into my inbox every Thursday afternoon. Is one of the only newsletters that I actually take on board because I think he's got so many great things to say. But where we're actually talking about resilience, he talks about mental toughness is persistence, not intensity. And this is about doing the little things every day that actually help make a difference rather than one big brushstroke. So look at little things. If you were actually going to run a marathon, you wouldn't think that you could do it all, you know, all at once. You'd actually maybe look at walking first and then doing a little bit of running and walking and continuing to build up. As long as you're doing something every day. And this is what actually having a resilient mindset is all about. Thinking about the persistence. What am I able to do daily that is actually going to help me build up rather than fight away from that? So when I actually look at being resilient, it's about our coping mechanisms. And I just want to show you my seesaw of coping, because this was taken from some work that was done about the dynamics of stress. And when we actually look at this coping mechanism, well, then we see that the seesaw, when we've got coping mechanisms in place, and we've got many coping mechanisms in place, if we start to get some sources of pressure, well, then the coping mechanisms can actually come down here and make sure that we grow from it. We learn from the mistakes, or we learn from different things that are actually going on. We take those experiences on board, and we actually find that all of those tools and techniques become something that we've got in our kit bag to actually move and use for the next time. However, when we've got little coping mechanisms in place, well, then we find that the sources of pressure become too large and they push down on this side, and then it becomes stressful for us. So we need to be just thinking about how we're using the coping mechanisms that we have in place, because I would imagine that we've all been through lots of different situations. And if you think of all of those different situations that you've had so far, you'll think of ways that you've actually been able to bounce back. And it's often when we have a situation that happens to us and we give the time in between so that the emotions have died down from it, if we reflect and see what we've actually done in those situations, well, then we can actually pull out some key learning. So let me give you my first coping mechanism, because this is all about you having a choice to respond to different situations. Now, Stephen Covey was a guy that wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he actually said, your life doesn't just happen. It's about the choices that you actually make in there. And so where we have every situation, there's a new choice of how we want to respond to it. Now that might feel, oh, well, Jane, you know, I'm usually in the mire before I actually think about, you know, how I'm actually coping. And by that time I've reacted. But it's about slowing down and thinking about how we want to deal with things. So we have this stimulus and we have the response. In the middle, we have to have that freedom to choose. And somebody who actually talked about this and probably put the best quote, I would say, together for this was Viktor Frankl, who wrote in the book of In Man's Search for Meaning that everything can be taken from a man, but one thing. The last of his human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in every given set of circumstances, to choose one's way. And if you think about everything that he went through, his mind was the one thing that actually took him forward, that he knew that people could beat his body, he could actually be hurt in lots of different ways. But he was the one that was in control of his mind. And he was the one that was actually thinking about how we can actually use our mindset to best avail. Now, when you're thinking about things, we actually look at whether it's our limiting beliefs or whether it's our experiences that we've taken on board that actually create the thoughts that we have in our mindsets. So it's just looking at that and having those habits in place to actually move that forward. Now, this might mean that we've got some learning and some unlearning that we've got to do, because habits form over a period of time. And it's those little things that we actually do daily and take forward. So if we actually look at our ladder, well, then our ladder moves from us not knowing what we know, not knowing what we don't know, through to just getting on and doing things as a natural habit. In fact, let me ask you to do something now for me, if you wouldn't mind. And what I'd like you to do is I would like you to get a piece of paper and a pen in front of you. In fact, I'm going to just stop sharing for the moment so that I can see you. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to just write your name down on a piece of paper. Bless you. Now, what I'd like you to do is put your pen down, pick it up with the other hand, and write your name again, please. So, how was it the first time? All okay? Yeah? Did you have to think much about doing it? No? All okay. What about the second time then? Was it like going back to school? I can see your face, Jane. So, yeah? Going back to school, had to really slow down, had to think about it. You wanted it to be neat, I bet. How many was thinking, oh, it's like being 4 or 5 years old again? Now, this is what I'm saying about being on an automatic pilot. How many of you drive? Yeah? can you think about, you know, when you were younger? I can think about when I was in my mum's car and I was a passenger, and I was thinking, oh, I can't wait to drive. I'm going to be free as a bird, you know, I'll be able to come home when I feel like it rather than being picked up. And, you know, and that was absolutely key.
Get there and get. If I was your age, I wouldn't go. It's a truth.
Jodie, thanks. So when we're actually looking at that, let me just share back again, because when I'm talking about this, well, then I'm going to go on this ladder. So when I'm in that car with my mum and I don't know what I'm actually doing, I'm in this unconscious incompetence. And then I get behind the wheel for the first time. And oh my goodness, there's 3 pedals that are down there. And there's something that I've got to do with the pedal at the same time I do with my left hand. And there's 2 sticks on the steering wheel that I've got to deal with. And there's 3 mirrors that I've got to use. And suddenly I'm really conscious of what I can't do. But over a period of time, I have my lessons and I become consciously competent. And I'm really good because I've got that mirror signal maneuver straight off pat, you know. Even when I come to a mini roundabout, I indicate and I go right the way around it rather than just hopping over. And then I'm in that situation now where there's sometimes I drive home and I don't even think about it. Anybody else like that? Yeah? And it's because we're in that, you know, that unconscious competence, that we're in a situation where we just do things without thinking. And we need to be in that situation because in our heads, we've got between 40 and 70,000 thoughts that are going on in our mind every day. And so we need to be able to do some of those on automatic pilot, but there are other things that we really, really need to be thinking about. Now, the reason that I'm telling you about this is because we've got so many habits that we do on a day-to-day basis that can either be hindering us or helping us. So one of the things that I'd like to give you as a tool is to do a habit inventory. I think that if you can actually get up in the morning, think about from the time you get up in the morning to the time that you're going to bed at night, what are the habits that you actually have? Make them really conscious. Because if you're anything like me, you'll find that some of those habits that you had that weren't very good for you, well, then you can actually do something about. So the one that I'm talking about is good old Mr. Mobile Phone. So I used to have the mobile phone next to my bed on a night time. Now, there were lots of things that were happening there. So because I would look at it before I went to sleep, all that beautiful blue light seeping through into my mind, probably looking at lots of different activities that, you know, or stories or researching things that, you know, would get in my mind going. And so therefore making me not sleep very well at night as well. The other thing that I was doing is I was having my mobile phone as my alarm clock. So what was happening was I was turning off my alarm and straight away getting into work mode because I'd be seeing how many emails I'd actually had, who'd been texting me, who'd been WhatsApping me. This is before I'd even got out of bed and done my ablutions or spoken to somebody, you know, maybe my other half. I hadn't even said good morning to him because I'd actually been looking on my phone. So now my phone has a bedtime like I do. And I make sure that I put it in the kitchen, and if it's actually with me, it goes on to grey mode at 10 o'clock at night, and it doesn't come off until 8 o'clock in the morning. If you've ever used grey mode on your phone, you'll realise that it makes it very unattractive and you don't want to actually look at it. So it stops you with all that scrolling. So that's just one of my key ones on actually looking at your habits. Do that habit inventory and see how you get on with it. I'm just going to go back and share my screen again. So that was my second one. Think about your habits and how you're actually taking those forward. The next thing is think about circles of influence and control. This is something again of Stephen Covey's work. And it's actually looking at all those issues that are going around in your head. Write them down on a piece of paper. And then think about what are the ones that you can control, what are the ones you can influence, and which are the ones that are out of your control. Because if you're anything like me, or how I used to be, was I used to think about all the things that I couldn't control and worry about them. And actually that is time that's really ill spent, because what we should be doing is looking at the things that are actually in our control and getting to work on those. Because you never know that when you start work on the things that are actually in your control, you get those going and you start building your self-esteem and your confidence. And so you start moving that out, and actually then you start working on the things that you can influence. And you never know, these circles may become so big that the things that you first thought were out of your control, you actually can deal with. Now, I think this is a fantastic model to actually use either for yourselves, for your kids. I mean, one of the ones, if I give you an example, one of the things that happened many years ago, and it always stands in my mind because it was using this absolute technique, was one of my girlfriends had a daughter who was going on her first school trip. And I don't know whether you can take yourself back to your first school trip and how excited you were and coming home from school and thinking about, you know, how brilliant it was going to be. But where Catherine was concerned, well, then she came back and she was all really, really excited, couldn't think about how the things were going to be. And, you know, she was going on a school bus and she was going to Paris for 2 nights and it was all going to be amazing. Yet the weekend before she was going to go, my girlfriend went up to see her in her bedroom and she was all upset. She didn't want to go on the trip anymore. She decided it wasn't for her after all. And so my friend said, well, come on, let's go downstairs and sit at the table and let's have a talk through all of these things. So tell me what's worrying you. What kind of things are going on for you that, you know, are making you feel that you don't want to go? And she said, well, you know what? The first thing is that I don't know who I'm going to be sitting next to on the bus. Nobody wants to sit next to me on the bus. And so she said, well, do you know that? And so she said, no. She said, well, is there anything that you can do about it? And so she said, well, maybe I can actually get in touch with Helen and see if she'd like to sit next to me on the bus. And so she said, well, do you want to do that? She said, yes. And so she ran off and she came back and she was delighted because she'd actually, Helen was going to sit next to her on the bus, and actually Helen was worried about who she was going to sit next to as well. So that was, you know, 2 things that were ticked off the list and sorted out. And they went through all of the individual things that were on the list, and sure enough, they were able to tick most of them off, apart from one thing. And one of the things was, what if she didn't like the hotel? So my friend said to her, how many nights are you going to stay in this hotel? And so she said, 2, Mummy. She said, how old do you think you're going to live? And so she said, well, I would think at least 80. She said, so if you had 2 nights out of the 80 years, well then, do you think it's a big thing? She said, no, I'm being silly, aren't I? And off she went, and she went to pack her case. Now my friend Fiona said the next day she drove her to school, and she jumped onto this bus, and she sat down with her friend, and she hardly had time to wave to her mum to actually, you know, say goodbye. But it's this whole thing about, let's look at the things that we can control, and let's look at the things that we can influence. Because actually some of those things that are out of our control, well then, you know, it's about spending time in that area and worrying about things that, you know, we can't do things about, that eat up and make us that worry wart. So that's my 3rd thing. Think about what you can do rather than what you can't do. Let's go back to my slides and see what's the next one there that I'd like to share. So the next one is about beliefs. And where I look at beliefs, well then, these are perceived truths. They're things that have actually happened to us throughout our life. So our experiences, they're the foundations of kind of how we act and behave. And when I look at beliefs, well then, you know, they're the filters that we carry around. They affect how we see and react to things around us. They can trigger those hot buttons and our personal effectiveness. But you know what? We've got to keep on challenging them because they can be outdated. They can be things that, you know, it's that stereotypical talking that we're actually hearing in our heads rather than being able to use it to great avail. And I don't know about you, but, you know, I've had some of these kind of thoughts that have gone around in my head. It's the good old Eeyore sitting on my shoulder, and that I must be perfect, must be liked by everybody. When my ideas are rejected, so am I. I've got to be in control. If things go wrong, it's my fault. I'm not very good at, I can't say no at. all of these kind of things. And, even when I started my own business, 15 years ago, well, then there was one of the things that I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I haven't got an ology. How am I actually ever going to get on without an ology? And so looking at, how I could actually move through and deal with things. Now, one of the tools that I actually came across was something called the emotional perceptual lens. And this is when I was doing some training on emotional intelligence. And I think this is a fantastic tool for you to use. And I have to say that I think I've used it every single day of my life since I've actually come across it. So what I would like you to do is I'd like you to go back to your piece of paper, take a plain sheet, and I'd like you to put these 5 boxes in the middle of the sheet so that you can actually write down either side. So I'm going to give you some things to actually put down this side, and I'm going to give you some things to put down the right-hand side of it. And this is all about creating self-fulfilling prophecies, because our mind is that most powerful part. And it's this whole thing about what Henry Ford said here. If you think you can or you think you can't, you're probably right. And so it's how we actually trick our mind when we're feeling maybe a bit nervous to actually be able to do things that are right for us. So first of all, we've got the emotion. Whenever you're going into a situation, and it could be an interview, it could be a presentation, anything, well, then you have got to choose the emotion. Now, for example, if I was feeling, say, nervous this morning about coming on here and doing my presentation, let's just put nervous, write nervous up here. Because the thoughts that I might be having going around in my head is, oh, what if it goes wrong? What if I can't remember what to say? What if they don't actually engage with my presentation? The technology might all go wrong. I wonder if my Wi-Fi will drop down. There's lots of thoughts that are actually coming in there that make me feel even more nervous. So if I'm nervous, well, then those are the thoughts that might be going around in my head. That then manifests itself in my behaviour. So my behaviour when I'm feeling nervous and I've got those thoughts going around in my head is that I maybe talk more quickly than normal. I actually try to whiz through things without giving any examples of how that may happen and how that may go forward. I don't give eye contact, or I'm maybe fiddling, or I make mistakes, or all of these kind of things happen with my behaviour. So therefore, the short-term result is that you decide, oh, well, I'm going to drop off this call. I'm going to see what's happening on the other session that's somewhere else. It might be that, I don't get my information across in the way that I want to get it across. And the long-term results is that Melanie never wants to put me forward again for anything else. And so, we see that in the long-term results. Now, if I had another emotion, if I chose another emotion, and that emotion could be excitement, if we start working down this side, well then, when I'm feeling excited about something, I'm really looking forward to the activity. And I can't wait to be involved, and I'm thinking about how many people are going to be on the session and what kind of questions they're going to have for me, and the debate's going to be a great one, and looking at how I can get the things across in the best possible way. And therefore you see my behaviour coming across as more smiley, more engaging, looking at what we can do rather than what we can't do, and making that something that then links into the short-term results. That we have lots of activities that are happening there, you're getting involved. The longer term result is maybe we actually do more work together. Maybe we actually look at other things that can go forward. How does this feel with people? I'm going to stop the share right now and see, what kind of things are coming up for people. Did I see a question going into the...
No, that was just me saying, please put questions in the chat. So wow. Don't be shy, please put them in.
Okay, so when we're actually looking at that kind of activity going on, well then it's really important, because working with our mind, sometimes, have you heard the saying, you've got to fake it till you make it? And, you know, that fake it till you make it is really, really important because it's about building neural pathways. Our mind doesn't have to experience something for it to think it's actually happened. If we're talking to ourselves in a negative way, and we continue to talk to ourselves in a negative way, it builds that neural pathway that things aren't going right. So the more that we can speak to ourselves positively and be looking at how we follow those kind of things up, that will actually work for us. So, you know, if you have got an interview that you're going for and you're looking forward to it and you're choosing that emotion of how you can look forward to it, well then, you know, that can be great. And just think about it. I chose what? Anxiety, nervousness, and excitement. If we think of the characteristics of both of those, you know, if I'm thinking about anxiety, I might have butterflies in my tummy, I might be talking quickly, I might get red and flushed in my face, I might have sweaty palms. But actually, when I'm feeling excited, I can have exactly the same characteristics. So it's how you want to read those and how you maybe want to look at them from a different point of view that we can actually take that across and make that work for us. So we need to actually then layer that on one other thing as well. Oh, actually, just let me tell you about one other part of that as well, because I think the more emotions that you can build up in your hip pocket, I know it sounds a really funny thing to say, but I would actually try lots of these kind of activities when you're out and about. So it might be when you're with friends. It could be when I was traveling a lot. Well, then I used to try out different emotions, you know, if I was at a hotel. So maybe the receptionist, if I wanted to be more confident, or I wanted to try out something in particular. We'll see how it landed, so that you're creating that engagement, because as soon as you've actually tried them out a few more and you know what confidence looks like, feels like, sounds like, well, then you could actually be putting that into play. It goes back to that, you know, fake it till you make it kind of situation. So bringing it to the fore and making it happen for you.
Just got a question, Jane, sorry.
Yeah, go.
It's linked to what you've been talking about, so I'm stopping you at this point to ask it. In an interview situation, a question from Jane, another Jane, in an interview situation, how can you switch to excitement or confidence when natural feelings are of nervousness, especially if you really want the job?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I would actually look at there is how you talk to yourself before you go in that preparation style, about making everything a conversation, and looking at, you know, what really interests you about it, so that if you can position it as a chat about, you know, what it is about the job, finding out as much, so you're as curious about them as what they are about you, it helps you to actually dampen down some of those nerves. And as I've just said, if we look at the characteristics, tell yourself that they're excitement, you know, those nerves, that it's excitement about what you're going to find out, what are you going to really learn about the job, what you can really show that is great about you in those kind of situations, why that job has got the name on it, your name on it. Does that help, Jane?
Oh. Shall we unmute you, Jane, so you can speak? You're unmuted now, Jane. Oh, still can't hear you though. Okay, your sound's not working, so no worries. Thank you for the question. Hopefully
Send it in the chat.
Yes, in the chat. We have another question from Louise Jacobs, who's one of our trustees. Can you help us to understand a bit better, please, how you get rid of the negative voices in your head? Often my inner voice or my inner critic can get the better of me. Thank you.
Yes, and one of the things that I do, Louise, and I often say to myself, I ask myself the question, would I speak to a friend like this? So if I was in this if my friend was in this situation and she was talking to me and was saying that she had the same thoughts that were going on in her head, how would I give her some advice to actually deal with it differently? Because, you know, there we can actually pick up different elements. But I think also looking at what's a different perspective on this. What could be a silver lining? Because the more that we actually focus on the silver lining and think about, you know, how could this be different? Is this true, or is it, you know, or is it fake? Are these situations real? what's a really good thing that's going to happen from this situation? It helps us be able to deal with it more effectively.
That's brilliant, really helpful, thank you.
Pleasure, Louise. Okay.
No more questions for now.
Righto, well then I'll go back and let me see where I am on my share screen. So this was called the emotional perceptual lens, and as I say, it's been fantastic because even in a, when we're in a situation of being in a room in a workshop, there's maybe one person that you spend all your time on, or with a team, one person that you spend all the time with because, they have that place in your head. And I call it living rent free. When we actually let them live rent free, well, then it tends to be a monster that's actually built. So it's actually about how we're looking at that and how we're dealing with it and taking it forward. Another element that if we layer on top of it with the emotional perceptual lens is about optimism. And a key for me with optimism is that, we really need to be looking at 3 elements. And this whole thing is that about personal, taking responsibility, permanency, so is it one time or is it forever? And pervasiveness, so is it something that, will just be local to this one situation, or will it actually impact on everything that's around there? Now, my view on optimism is that it's about having hope that things will turn out in a positive way, and that's the way that we want to get it. Maybe the glass is half full. I love this picture because, it makes us think about, winter time as we are at the moment, with the trees and no leaves on it. And then when we get to spring, and, it's all back to being green and lovely. So it's just thinking about optimism in this way. And when we actually look at optimism, the personal side of it is that, when things go right, well, then I had some dealing with that. When you think about the permanency, well, then it just doesn't happen one time. I seem to get things right a lot of times. And the pervasiveness is, it doesn't just happen when I'm actually doing these kind of workshops, but actually it follows me around and I'm actually really involved in it. Now think about the pessimist in the same kind of situation. When something goes bad, you hear that kind of mirrored, because the pessimist will think, oh, well, it always happens to me. I knew it was going to go wrong. And it just doesn't happen in this way, but it happens in everything that I'm actually doing. So going back to Louise's point earlier on, well, then thinking about what we can actually be doing and being kind to ourselves, that if something does go wrong, well, then it's not like us for this to normally happen to us. It's about how we can actually say, right, that happened this time. What was the learning from it? Let's dig deep and move on and see what we can do differently the next time, and having that hope. But it also becomes part of our language that we have. And I don't know whether you're one of those people, but I've heard myself, and I think it's something that, being a people pleaser. I'd always been a people pleaser. And so sorry was in my vocabulary. Sorry for being late. Sorry I'm talking so quickly. Sorry I'm hogging the arena, rather than, thank you for waiting for me. And thank you for spending time listening to me. It's all of these kind of things that we need to be actually looking at our language and how we're taking that forward. And having that but, replace the but with an and, because it helps us to forge more positive language as we move forward. But my favourite out of all words, and it came from some work that was done by Carol Dweck that actually looks at how we build a growth mindset rather than having a fixed mindset, is a little 3-letter word called yet. So when you hear that voice in your head and it says, I can't do this, just put that little word on the end, yet, because it changes the whole way we think about it. So if we actually look at, I can't do that yet, it gives us that optimism that we can actually do it in the future and think about how we can actually move that forward. So that's another little element that we can actually think about in taking that forward and kind of linking it into our positive mindset, because when we think about positive mindsets, well, then we recognise these things, that we know that shit does happen time to time. It is there, and, it can actually throw us sideways for a time, but it's actually standing back and giving us some space between it and making it an activity that we can take on and deal with differently next time. that we can use the 3 Ps of optimism to move in the right direction. So think about, maybe, this has happened this time, but it's not personal to me. It doesn't often happen, and it doesn't happen with everything that I'm involved in. And you know that in your kit bag, you've got things that you've bounced back from it. If you think about everything that's happened in the past, maybe think about 3 things that you're really proud of and what you've learned from those kind of situations. And then if you think about 3 things that maybe didn't go so well and what you've actually learned from those, that's really, really, really key as well. But let me give you the last thing that I want you to do. And this is something called square breathing. So it's another little activity that I'd like you to do. And I'd like you to sit in your chair. And let me come away from, let me show you it actually. So I'd like you to sit in your chair, and I'd like you to have both feet on the ground, and I'd like you to put your hands in your lap. And if you want, you can also close your eyes, because this is a breathing exercise that I'm going to work with you, and it's about square breathing. And I think breathing is probably one of the key exercises that's given the least well, we don't think about breathing as an exercise at all. It's just something that happens. But I want it to be more. I want us to be more conscious about it. So if you sit with your hands in your lap, maybe close your eyes, feet both on the ground, and I want you to think about. We're going to breathe in for 2. We're going to hold for 2. We're going to breathe out for 2, and then we're going to hold for 2. So we're going to do this first of all, and then what it's actually doing, it's helping us just to relax and feel calm. So let's start. So if you want to close your eyes and you want to breathe in for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2, and out for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2. Let's go around again. So in for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2, and out for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2. Now this time, if you want to actually add some visualization to it, because sometimes it's easier when we're actually more visual to be able to see things and actually help our systems calm down even more. So when we're actually doing the in for 2, pretend you're drawing a line in your mind that's going from the left to the right corner. And when you're holding this time, you're going from that right corner down to the bottom corner. And when you breathe in for 2, well, then we're going from right to left. And then when we're actually holding, we're going up to the top again. So I'm going to count it a couple more times and try it out and see how you get on. So we're going to go in for 2, 1, 2, hold for 2, 1, 2, out for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2, and in for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2, and out for 2, 1, 2, and hold for 2, 1, 2. So there we have, that is what I call our square breathing. And you know, square breathing, I hope you'll feel that you're kind of calm now. I'll bring you back before you actually drop off to sleep. But I hope you're feeling calmer now. It's something that is actually used across the world from the Army and the Navy. They use it in combat. Just before they're jumping out into combat from the helicopters, they do that square breathing. And it's just to actually calm and focus our attention where we actually want it to be. So I hope you found that interesting. I hope it's been useful. We've had looking at choices, how to respond. We've looked at the habit inventory, so take that away. Your circles of influence and control, so don't spend time worrying about things that you can't do. Look at the things that you can do. Our emotional perceptual lens in taking that forward. thinking about optimism and our language. So use that little word yet to give you that focus on optimism, and then think about your breathing, because I think it's one of the most underrated exercises that we can do to help us be more resilient and deal with things as we actually go forward. So I'm going to stop the share there and I'll come back to the room.
Jane, thank you very much. We just have a couple more questions. One just, Ketty just asked whether we would be able to share the presentation with people who have attended. Are you happy for us to do that, Jane? Or you can tell me later whether that's...
Okay.
Right, okay,
Yeah.
we can talk about that. And Jane, who asked the question about the interview earlier, whose sound isn't working so well, she tells us that it's actually a recorded interview that has 6 set questions. This is a particular method of interviewing of our time, really, and very, very tricky, I think, when there isn't anybody there. It's not live, it's pre-recorded, and the answers have to be the STAR method. Any tips there?
If she wants to spend some time with me, I'm happy to do that as a one-off. So yeah, Jane, get in touch and I'll do that. But I think that the whole thing is, I would actually add one onto the STAR. So, you know, usually we're talking about the situation, the technique or the task, the activity. One of the things that I'd actually add on is the learning that you got from it, because I think that helps you stand out from the crowd. Because it's okay talking about all of those elements, but if you actually look at the learning that you took away that makes you, you know, more resilient, stronger, candidate, you know, all of those kind of things, it's really worthwhile.
Jane, that was so helpful. Thank you very much. My favourite bit is the emotional perpetual lens, which I'm sure I will be using again and again. But so many tips, so many ideas, ways of really just making us feel more positive when we have a reason to feel a little bit negative. As I said at the beginning, a great way for us to feel more resilient at the moment, but particularly I think when some of us are looking for jobs and facing rejection. Facing rejection comes with the territory when you're looking for a job. And I think, yeah, we have to be so positive when we go along to the next interview and the next interview. So having some of these tips at our disposal is great. And I'm just waking up following the breathing exercises. Thank you very much, Jane.
I think one of those things on the emotional perceptual lens as well is that when you're working down the right hand side, be realistic when you're going through there, because I think you might have heard me say that, you know, I'm looking forward to the debate, I'm looking forward to questions, all of those kind of things, because if we just have our positive lens on, that's going to be, you know, it's all going to be wonderful and it's all just going to go smoothly. Well, then we can feel that, you know, when we do get a hitch, well, then that knocks us back. So it's about being realistic as we're going down the right-hand side. It's not just, you know, all rose-tinted glasses. Think about, you know, so when somebody does ask me a question, how's that going to feel? So you can actually imagine yourself, you can visualize it, and then you can actually take that moment to actually deal with it more effectively.
Lovely. Thank you very much indeed, Jane. Really helpful.
Pleasure
to
indeed.
us. I'm sure we'll be using your tips for a long time to come. Thank you to all of you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I can see a lot of applause there, which is nice.
Thank you.
And look forward to seeing you at the next session. Well, we have 2 sessions again for you to choose from, and then a final question and answers at the end. Thank you very much.
Super. Thank you.
Bye.